The sound of ceramic shattering against sterile tile echoed through the surgical wing of Walter Reed National Military Medical Centers like a gunshot. Every head in the corridor turned, every conversation stopped mid-sentence. And standing in the epicenter of the destruction, surrounded by fragments of what had been a coffee mug 3 seconds ago, was a woman whose hands trembled so violently that the remaining drops of liquid fell from her fingers like rain from shaking leaves. Dr. Silas Hartwell stood 6 feet away, his arms crossed over his pristine white coat, his expression caught somewhere between disgust and theatrical disappointment. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the kind of silver-streaked hair that graced the covers of medical journals and the sort of jaw that suggested generations of good breeding. At 53, he was the chief of surgery at one of the most prestigious military medical facilities in the world, and he wore that title the way some men wore expensive watches, constantly checking to make sure everyone noticed. Again, Thornton? His voice carried the particular resonance of a man accustomed to being heard in operating theaters and boardrooms alike. That's the 3rd mug this week. At this rate, we should bill your salary directly to the hospital's ceramics budget. Hazel Thornton didn't look up. She was already lowering herself to her knees, her trembling fingers reaching for the largest shards, with the careful deliberation of someone who had long ago accepted that simple tasks required extraordinary concentration. She was 38 years old, though the shadows beneath her eyes and the permanent tension in her shoulders suggested someone who had lived several lifetimes within that span. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her scrubs hung loosely on a frame that seemed deliberately designed to take up as little space as possible. "I'm sorry, Dr. Hartwell." Her voice emerged raspy, barely above a whisper. "I'll clean it up immediately." "Sorry." Hartwell let the word hang in the air like an accusation. "You're always sorry, aren't you, Thornton? Sorry when you drop things. Sorry when you can't keep up. Sorry when you exist in my surgical wing, like some sort of cautionary tale about what happens when the HR department loses its collective mind." A few of the younger nurses exchanged glances. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched with the kind of fascinated attention usually reserved for car accidents, their expressions carefully neutral, but their eyes bright with interest. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Hartwell continued, taking a step closer. His shadow fell across Hazel like a verdict. "I see a surgeon who can't hold a scalpel. I see a medical degree gathering dust. I see a woman who should have had the dignity to walk away years ago, instead of haunting this hospital like some pathetic ghost of professional failure." Hazel's fingers continued their patient work, picking up ceramic fragments one by one, her hands shaking with each movement. She didn't respond to the insults. She didn't defend herself. She simply worked, methodical and silent, as if Hartwell's words were nothing more than background noise. "You know what the residents call you?" Hartwell's voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "The Tremor. Not even Dr. Tremor, just the Tremor, because that's all you are to them. A cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when your body betrays your ambition." Still, Hazel said nothing. She gathered the last of the ceramic pieces into her palm, her hands shaking so badly that 2 small fragments slipped through her fingers and skittered across the floor. Hartwell sighed with theatrical exhaustion. 27 minutes until we have a multi-trauma case arriving. If you can't be useful, at least be invisible. Go, reorganize the supply closet or something. Stay out of the way of actual medical professionals." He turned and strode away, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. Hazel remained on her knees for a moment longer, her head bowed, her trembling hands pressed flat against the cold tile. 30 medical professionals had witnessed that exchange. Not one had spoken in her defense. Not one had offered to help her clean up. She was used to it. 2 years she had worked at Walter Reed. 2 years of filing charts, updating records, and performing the administrative tasks that required no surgical precision and no steady hands. 2 years of being overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed by colleagues who couldn't understand why a trained surgeon with documented credentials would accept demotion to the level of a medical clerk. They didn't know why her hands shook. They didn't care enough to ask. And in 20 minutes, everything they thought they knew about Dr. Hazel Thornton was going to be completely and irreversibly wrong. But she didn't know that yet. None of them did. Hazel pushed herself to her feet, deposited the ceramic fragments in the nearest waste bin, and wiped her trembling hands on her scrubs. She had learned, over many years and through experiences that would have broken most people, that the insults of small men were irrelevant in the larger calculus of survival. Silas Hartwell thought he was powerful because he could humiliate her in front of their colleagues. He had no conception of what real power looked like. She moved down the corridor toward the supply closet, her gait slightly uneven, favoring her left leg in a way that most people attributed to an old injury. Which it was, technically. They just didn't know what kind of injury, or where it had been sustained, or why the woman who walked with a slight limp could also move with a fluidity that occasionally betrayed training far more specialized than any medical school provided. The surgical wing of Walter Reed was a controlled chaos of efficiency. Nurses moved with purpose between patient rooms. Residents clustered in small groups, their conversations a mixture of medical terminology and cafeteria gossip. Monitors beeped their steady rhythms. Somewhere, a patient coughed. The ventilation system hummed its constant white noise. Hazel moved through it all like water flowing around stones, present but unremarkable, noticed but instantly forgotten. It was a skill she had cultivated with the same dedication other surgeons applied to perfecting their technique. The ability to be invisible was, in certain professions, more valuable than any amount of technical brilliance. She passed the recovery ward where post-surgical patients dozed in their morphine hazes. Her eyes, though cast downward in apparent submission, tracked every face, every monitor, every potential point of entry and exit. Old habits, the kind that never fully died, no matter how many years of peace intervened. Thornton, the voice stopped her mid-step. Dr. Amber Lawson was leaning against the nurse's station, surrounded by a small cluster of colleagues like a queen holding court. She was 32, blonde, and possessed the kind of aggressive beauty that came from expensive skincare routines and absolute certainty in her own superiority. She had graduated from Johns Hopkins at the top of her class and had never let anyone forget it. "I heard the most interesting thing about you yesterday," Amber said, her voice carrying the sweet poison of gossip disguised as casual conversation. "Apparently, before you came to Walter Reed, you were at Mercy General in Virginia. And apparently, you left under, shall we say, less than ideal circumstances." The nurses around her leaned in slightly, their expressions hungry. "Someone told me you were involved in a patient death." Amber's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Some kind of surgical complication. Your hands started shaking during the procedure, and by the time anyone could take over, the patient was already gone." Hazel stood perfectly still. Her hands, as always, trembled at her sides. "Is that true, Thornton? Did you kill someone?" The corridor seemed to grow smaller, the air thicker. Other staff members had stopped at their tasks to listen, their faces a mixture of curiosity and second-hand embarrassment. "There was a complication," Hazel said quietly. "The patient had an undiagnosed bleeding disorder. It wasn't anyone's fault." "But your hands were shaking," Amber pressed. "During the surgery, that's what I heard. Your hands were shaking so badly you couldn't complete the procedure. The board cleared me of any wrongdoing." "The board!" Amber laughed, and the sound was a knife wrapped in silk. "The board doesn't have to work next to you every day. The board doesn't have to wonder if the woman updating their charts is one bad day away from another body count." A few of the nurses exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a braid, looked away rather than participate in the spectacle. "I have work to do," Hazel said, her voice flat. "Excuse me." She continued down the corridor, leaving Amber and her audience behind, the whispered comments following her like shadows. She didn't react. She didn't defend herself further. She simply walked, her trembling hands clasped in front of her, her expression as blank as a winter sky. The supply closet was at the end of the corridor, a small room filled with medical supplies organized with military precision on metal shelves. Hazel stepped inside and closed the door behind her, finally alone. For a long moment, she simply stood there, her back against the door, her eyes closed. The trembling in her hands continued, rhythmic and constant, like a metronome that never stopped. Then, slowly, she lifted her right hand and held it in front of her face. She looked at it, she focused. And for exactly 3 seconds, her hand went completely still. Not a tremor, not a shake, not the slightest deviation from perfect steadiness. Then, deliberately, consciously, she let the shaking return. The tremors resumed their constant rhythm, and Hazel Thornton lowered her hand and began organizing supplies with the careful patience of someone who had all the time in the world. No one knew, no one suspected, and that was exactly how she needed it to stay. The supply closet door swung open without warning, and Hazel instinctively shifted her weight to her back foot, before catching herself and returning to her normal posture. The transition took less than a quarter of a second, invisible to anyone not specifically trained to notice such things. Nurse Ivy Caldwell stood in the doorway, a cup of water in her hand, and concern written across her features. She was in her late 20s, with the kind of open, honest face that made patients trust her immediately and colleagues underestimate her intelligence. "I saw what happened out there," Ivy said softly, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Dr. Hartwell was way out of line, and Amber," she shook her head, "that rumor she's spreading isn't even accurate. I looked up your file. The board investigation specifically stated that the complication was unavoidable." Hazel accepted the cup of water with trembling hands, a few drops spilling over the rim. "Thank you, but you shouldn't involve yourself. Hartwell doesn't like people who defend me. It'll make your life difficult." "Maybe," Ivy shrugged. "But my life's already difficult, and someone should say something. The way they treat you isn't right." Hazel took a careful sip of water, her hands shaking throughout the motion. But something in her eyes, just for a moment, softened with genuine gratitude. It was the first warmth she had shown all these. "You're kind," she said. "That's rare here." "It shouldn't be rare. It should be normal." Ivy studied Hazel's face with an expression that suggested she was seeing more than the surface. "Can I ask you something? You don't have to answer." Hazel waited. "Your hands." Ivy glanced down at the constant tremors. "I've worked with patients who have essential tremor, Parkinson's, various neurological conditions. Yours is different. The rhythm is almost too regular, too consistent." She paused. "It's like it's learned rather than involuntary." For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Hazel's eyes. Recognition, assessment, the rapid calculation of threat versus trust that had kept her alive in circumstances far more dangerous than a hospital supply closet. Then she smiled, small and sad. "You're very observant. Is that a yes or a no?" "It's a thank you for the water." Hazel set the cup down on a shelf. "I should get back to work. Hartwell will find something new to complain about if I take too long in here." Ivy stepped back in allowing Hazel to pass. But as the older woman reached the door, Ivy spoke again. "For what it's worth, I don't think you killed anyone. I think something happened to you that you're not talking about. And I think whatever it is, it's the reason you are hiding here instead of being wherever you're supposed to be." Hazel paused, her hand on the doorframe. She didn't turn around. "Everybody's hiding from something," she said quietly. "The lucky ones get to choose their hiding places." Then she was gone, slipping back into the corridor and the choreographed chaos of the surgical wing. Ivy stood alone in the supply closet, frowning at the empty doorway. Something about Hazel Thornton didn't add up. The tremors were too perfect. The submission was too complete. The woman who had just accepted humiliation without a flicker of resistance was the same woman who, for just a moment, had looked at Ivy with the assessing gaze of a predator, evaluating whether something was prey or threat. Ivy didn't know what to make of it, but she had a feeling she was going to find out. The surgical wing had returned to its normal rhythms when Hazel emerged from the supply closet. Dr. Archer Brennan was waiting for her, leaning against the wall, with the calculated casualness of someone who had positioned himself specifically to intercept her. He was 35, dark-haired, and possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that made him excellent at diagnosing problems and terrible at interacting with other human beings. "Thornton." He pushed himself off the wall and fell into step beside her. "Quick question. Medical knowledge check." Hazel continued walking, her eyes on the floor. "I have filing to complete. This will only take a minute. I'm curious." His tone suggested curiosity was the least of his motivations. "Name the 12 cranial nerves, in order." It was a test, a hazing ritual dressed up as professional inquiry. Every medical student learned the cranial nerves in their first year. Asking a trained surgeon to recite them was like asking a mathematician to count to 12, an insult wrapped in the pretense of legitimate assessment. Hazel was silent for a moment, and Archer's smile began to spread. "Can't remember?" he asked. "Maybe the tremors have spread to your memory." "Olfactory," Hazel said quietly. "Optic, oculomotor." She paused as if struggling to recall. "Trochlear, trigeminal." Another pause, longer this time. "Abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory. Hypoglossal. The answer was correct, completely, precisely correct. But the delivery had been hesitant, uncertain, her voice trailing off between each nerve as if she were pulling the information from some dusty corner of her mind, rather than from immediate recall. Archer's expression flickered with disappointment. He had wanted her to fail. Failing would have been useful. This, the stumbling success of a woman who clearly knew the material but couldn't present it with confidence, was merely pathetic. "Well," he said, "at least your memory works, even if nothing else does." He peeled away, disappearing into a patient room, leaving Hazel standing alone in the corridor. She didn't react. She simply continued walking, her trembling hands clasped in front of her, her face as expressionless as stone. But inside her mind, behind the mask of submission and incompetence, something was calculating, assessing, noting Archer Brennan's position in the hospital hierarchy, his relationship to Hartwell, his potential usefulness or threat in various scenarios. Old habits, the kind that never died. Nurse Supervisor Fiona Walsh intercepted Hazel outside the administrative offices. She was a severe woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features into permanent disapproval. She had worked at Walter Reed for 23 years and viewed any deviation from established protocol as a personal affront. "Thornton, my office. Now." Hazel followed without protest, her shoulders hunched in anticipation of whatever reprimand was coming. Fiona's office was a small, meticulously organized space where everything had its place and nothing was permitted to deviate from its assigned position. "Close the door," Hazel complied. Fiona sat behind her desk, her fingers steepled, her expression suggesting she was about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "I've been reviewing your performance metrics," Fiona began. "Filing accuracy, acceptable, chart updates, adequate, patient interaction, minimal, which, given your condition, is probably for the best." She paused. "But there's something that concerns me." Hazel waited, her hands trembling at her sides. "You've been at this hospital for 2 years. In that time, you've never requested accommodation for your disability. You've never complained about your treatment. You've never done anything to draw attention to yourself or advocate for your own interests." Fiona's eyes narrowed. "That's not normal." "I prefer to keep my head down," Hazel said quietly. "Yes, exactly. You prefer to be invisible." Fiona leaned forward. "Here's what I think. I think you're hiding something. I don't know what it is, and frankly I don't care, as long as it doesn't affect this hospital. But I'm watching you, Thornton. I'm watching everything you do, and if you step out of line, even once, I will personally ensure that you never work in medicine again." "I understand." "Do you?" Fiona's voice sharpened. "Because I've seen your type before. Quiet, compliant, accepting everything with that martyred patience. And then one day, something snaps, and suddenly there's a lawsuit or a scandal or a patient complaint that makes my life difficult." She stood, placing her palms flat on the desk. "Don't make my life difficult, Thornton. You won't enjoy the consequences." "I won't," Hazel said. "I just want to do my job. Then do it, and stay out of my way." Hazel left the office with the same quiet submission she had entered with. Fiona watched her go, her eyes tracking the trembling hands and the hunched shoulders with the predatory attention of someone who sensed weakness and couldn't resist probing it. She didn't notice that Hazel's gait, as she walked away, was slightly different than when she had entered, more fluid, more balanced, as if, for just a moment, the woman had forgotten to limp. The corridor outside the administrative offices led past the long-term care ward, where patients with extended recovery periods were housed in rooms designed for comfort rather than crisis. Hazel walked slowly, her eyes cast downward, but her attention was everywhere. Room 417 was occupied by Otis Brennan, no relation to Dr. Archer Brennan, despite the shared surname. He was 72 years old, a Vietnam veteran who had served 3 tours before his body finally gave out. He had been at Walter Reed for 6 weeks, recovering from surgery to repair damage that was decades old and only recently critical. As Hazel passed his open door, Otis looked up from his bed. His eyes, still sharp despite his years, tracked her movement with unusual intensity. "Hey," he called out, his voice raspy from disuse. "You, the one with the shaky hands." Hazel stopped, turned. "Yes, sir?" Otis squinted at her face, his brow furrowing with concentration. "Do I know you? You look familiar." "I don't think so, sir." I've only been here 2 years. Not from here, he waved a dismissive hand. From somewhere else. Somewhere. He trailed off, struggling to grasp a memory that kept slipping away. Never mind. Old brain playing tricks. Hazel nodded and continued on her way, but something in her posture had tightened almost imperceptibly, a tension that hadn't been there before. Behind her, Otis continued to stare at the doorway where she had disappeared, his mind churning through decades of faces and places, trying to match the woman with the trembling hands to a memory that felt important but remained just out of reach. Kandahar, 2017. The field hospital. The woman who had walked into hell. No, that couldn't be right. That woman had been a legend, a ghost, and she certainly wouldn't be shuffling through Walter Reed with shaking hands and a broken spirit. Would she? Dr. Derek Holloway found Hazel in the records room, where she was methodically filing patient charts in the archive system. He was 41, with the kind of forgettable face that made people constantly ask if they had met before, and the kind of personality that ensured they hoped they hadn't. He didn't announce himself. He simply appeared beside her, his shoulder bumping against the cart she was using to transport files. The cart lurched. Files slid. Hazel's trembling hands failed to catch them, and a cascade of manila folders spilled across the floor, papers scattering like leaves in wind. "Oh no," Derek's voice dripped with false concern. "I'm so sorry. I didn't see you there." Hazel dropped to her knees and began gathering the fallen files, her hands shaking so badly that she had to attempt each grab 2 or 3 times before successfully grasping the paper. "You know," Derek said, crouching beside her with the performance of helpfulness, "this kind of thing wouldn't happen if you could actually control your hands. Maybe you should consider a different line of work. Something that doesn't require fine motor skills, or any skills, really." Hazel said nothing. She continued gathering files, patient and silent. "I heard what Hartwell said to you this morning," Derek continued, "about you being a ghost of professional failure. I thought that was a bit harsh." He paused, timing his next words for maximum impact. But then again, ghosts don't really belong among the living, do they? A few other staff members had noticed the commotion. They watched from doorways and around corners, their faces carefully neutral, none of them moving to help. Hazel finished gathering the last of the scattered papers. She stood, slowly, her knees protesting the movement, and began resorting the files into their proper order. "Nothing to say?" Derek asked. "No defense? No comeback?" "There's nothing to defend," Hazel said quietly. "You bumped into me. I dropped the files. It happens. It happens to you a lot, doesn't it?" Derek smiled, satisfied. "That's the thing about people like you, Thornton. You think if you are quiet enough, submissive enough, eventually everyone will leave you alone. But they won't. Because there's nothing more satisfying than poking something that won't fight back." He straightened his coat and walked away, leaving Hazel alone with her scattered papers and her trembling hands and the weight of being invisible in a place where invisibility meant vulnerability. She continued sorting the files, patient and silent, always patient, always silent. But somewhere, far away, she could almost hear the sound of helicopter rotors, growing louder, coming closer. 20 minutes. Everything was about to change. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story about hidden identity and military secrets, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell icon. We upload videos about unsung heroes every single week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what happens when the Presidential Guard discovers who's really hiding in this hospital. Drop a comment below telling me, have you ever judged someone too quickly? Now, back to the story. The first indication that something unusual was happening came not from sight, but from sound. A distant thrum, rhythmic and mechanical, bleeding through the hospital's climate-controlled silence, like a heartbeat from another world. Most of the staff didn't notice it at first, too absorbed in their tasks and conversations to register the subtle vibration building in the air. Hazel noticed. She stopped mid-file, her head tilting slightly, her eyes focusing on nothing visible. The trembling in her hands continued unchanged, but something else shifted in her posture, a tension, an alertness, the coiled readiness of someone for whom unexpected sounds had once meant the difference between life and death. The thrum grew louder, closer. Now others were noticing too, their conversations trailing off, their heads turning toward the windows that lined the corridor. "Is that?" someone began. The answer came in the form of shadow. 4 massive shapes crossing the sun, their rotors beating the air into submission, as they descended toward the hospital in formation. Not the careful approach of medical transport helicopters. This was something else, something military, something urgent. Black Hawks, Hazel breathed, and for just a moment, her voice lost its raspy hesitation and carried the crisp recognition of someone who had spent years learning to identify aircraft by sound alone. No one heard her. They were all rushing toward the windows now, patients and staff alike drawn by the spectacle of 4 military helicopters descending on one of the nation's premier medical facilities. The birds touched down in the parking lot with the controlled violence of combat landings, their wash kicking up debris and sending unsecured objects tumbling across the pavement. Before the rotors had even begun to slow, doors were sliding open and figures were emerging. Men in tactical gear, full kit, weapons held at low ready. They moved with the fluid precision of operators who had trained together until movement became instinct, spreading out to secure the perimeter in a pattern that spoke of threat assessment and controlled aggression. What the hell is going on? Dr. Hartwell pushed his way to the front of the growing crowd at the windows, his face a mixture of outrage and fascination. This is a hospital, not a military base. Someone needs to call security. Security Chief Hugo Castillo was already running past, his radio crackling with urgent communications. Lockdown protocol initiated. Everyone stay in your current locations. This is not a drill. The tactical team had reached the hospital entrance now, a dozen armed men forming a corridor through which additional figures were emerging from the lead helicopter. Hazel watched from behind the crowd, her trembling hands hidden in the pockets of her scrubs, her face as blank as it had been all day. But her eyes were different. For the first time since arriving at Walter Reed 2 years ago, her eyes were alive. The lead figure from the helicopter was a giant of a man, easily 6'4", with shoulders that seemed designed to breach doors, and a face that suggested he had encountered every possible obstacle humanity could produce, and had simply walked through them. He wore the insignia of a captain, and he moved with the absolute authority of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself around his priorities. Agent Commander Caleb Shaw of the United States Secret Service. Presidential Protection Detail had not come to Walter Reed to ask questions. He had come to find something, or someone. His team swept through the hospital entrance like water through a breached dam, efficient and unstoppable. The security guards who had positioned themselves to control access took one look at the approaching force and stepped aside, their training no match for the primal recognition of overwhelming superiority. Shaw's voice echoed through the lobby, amplified by a throat mic and carrying the particular timbre of command that had been honed in war zones across 3 continents. Everyone remain exactly where you are. This is a matter of national security. Anyone who interferes will be detained. Anyone who obstructs will be removed. Dr. Hartwell pushed through the crowd, his ego overriding any sense of tactical caution. Now just a minute. This is my hospital. You can't just barge in here with weapons drawn and start issuing orders. I demand to know what's going on. Shaw turned to face him with the slow deliberation of a man who had dealt with self-important civilians before and had long ago stopped finding them impressive. Are you the chief of surgery? I am. Hartwell drew himself up to his full height, which was still 4 inches shorter than Shaw. Dr. Silas Hartwell, and I am responsible for everything that happens in this facility. Then you're not who I'm looking for. Shaw turned away, dismissing Hartwell with the casual brutality of complete irrelevance. We need Operation Zero, now. The words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Operation Zero. 2 words that meant nothing to almost everyone present, but which sent a ripple of something, recognition, fear, confusion, through the tactical team itself. Hartwell's face reddened with the particular fury of a man who had been dismissed in front of his subordinates. Operation Zero? I've never heard of any Operation Zero. If you're talking about a surgical procedure, I'm the most qualified person in this building to perform it. Shaw didn't bother turning around. You don't have the clearance to know what Operation Zero is. If you did, you wouldn't be asking questions. The crowd was growing now, staff and patients drawn by the commotion, despite the lockdown order. Among them, invisible and unremarkable, Hazel Thornton stood near the back, her trembling hands clasped in front of her, her eyes tracking every movement of the tactical team with the focused attention of someone cataloging potential threats and escape routes. A second figure had emerged from the helicopter formation and was now walking toward the hospital entrance with the measured stride of absolute authority. Even at a distance, the 4 stars on his shoulders were visible, glinting in the morning light like a constellation of power. General Solomon Blackwood was 71 years old and looked 60. He had survived 3 wars, 2 assassination attempts, and 1 particularly contentious Senate confirmation hearing. His face was a weathered map of decisions that had cost lives and saved thousands more, and his eyes held the weight of secrets that would never be declassified. When he entered the hospital lobby, the atmosphere changed. Even Shaw, imposing as he was, seemed to diminish slightly in the general's presence. This was a man who had commanded armies, who had advised presidents, who knew things that would never appear in any history book. "General," Shaw snapped to attention, "we've secured the facility, but we haven't located the asset yet." "Then find her." Blackwood's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the lobby with the penetrating authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "We're running out of time." Hospital Director Raymond Grant appeared from a side corridor, his face pale and sweating. He was a career administrator, skilled at budgets and board meetings, but entirely out of his depth in situations that involved military incursions and 4-star generals. "General Blackwood." He extended his hand, then withdrew it when Blackwood didn't acknowledge the gesture. "I'm Raymond Grant, director of this facility. Perhaps we could discuss whatever this is in my office." "Away from the patients and staff?" "No." Blackwood's single word carried more finality than most people's paragraphs. "What we need isn't in your office, Director Grant. What we need is somewhere in this hospital, and we will find it, with or without your cooperation." Grant swallowed hard. "Of course, whatever you need. We're honored to assist in any matter of national security." "You're not honored," Blackwood said flatly. "You're terrified, which is appropriate, given what's at stake." He turned to survey the crowd of medical staff that had gathered in the lobby, his eyes scanning each face with the systematic thoroughness of a man conducting a reconnaissance. "We're looking for a former service member, someone employed at this facility, someone who possesses capabilities that are required for a specific operation." Hartwell pushed forward again, his inability to remain marginalized apparently stronger than his survival instinct. "General, I assure you, I know every physician and surgeon on this staff. If there's someone with military medical experience, I would certainly be aware of it." "Would you?" Blackwood's gaze settled on Hartwell with the weight of careful assessment. "Tell me, Doctor, what do you know about the Omega unit?" The name produced an immediate reaction among the tactical team. Several operators exchanged glances. One of them, a woman with the rank insignia of a senior agent, took a subtle step backward, her hand drifting toward her sidearm. Hartwell frowned. "Omega unit? I've never heard of it." "Exactly." Blackwood turned away from him again. "Commander Shaw, begin the search. Check every face against the file. She'll have changed her appearance, probably her name, but she can't change her training. Look for behavioral markers." Shaw nodded and began issuing orders to his team, who spread out through the hospital corridors like wolves through a forest. The assembled staff watched them go with expressions ranging from fear to fascination to barely concealed excitement. In the back of the crowd, Hazel Thornton watched as well. Her trembling hands were hidden in her pockets. Her face was as blank as it had been all day, but beneath the mask of submission and insignificance, something was stirring. They were looking for someone. They were looking for her. Shaw moved through the surgical wing with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had conducted thousands of such searches. His team checked faces against a photograph on his tactical tablet, questioned staff members about their colleagues, and noted anyone who displayed unusual nervousness or attempted to leave the area. Hazel had positioned herself near the supply closet, where her presence could be explained by her administrative duties and where she had clear sight lines to 3 potential exit routes. She hadn't consciously made these calculations. They had simply happened, her training asserting itself despite years of deliberate suppression. She watched as Shaw stopped a young resident and asked her a series of questions. The resident's answers were nervous but cooperative, and Shaw moved on without incident. He was getting closer now, working his way down the corridor toward Hazel's position. Behind her, the supply closet door opened, and Ivy Caldwell slipped out, her eyes wide with barely contained excitement. "Can you believe this?" Ivy whispered. "Presidential guard at Walter Reed. I heard someone say they're looking for a specific person. A woman. Some kind of special operative." Hazel's expression didn't change. "Really?" "Some of the older nurses are saying it might be connected to the vice president. Apparently, he was supposed to be in Yemen this week, but that's not public information. Ivy leaned closer. Do you think something happened to him? Do you think that's why they're here? I don't know, Hazel said quietly. I just file charts. Shaw was 3 rooms away now, 2 rooms, 1. He stopped in front of Hazel, his eyes moving from her face to the tablet in his hand and back again. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply studying her with the intense focus of someone comparing reality against expectation. Name? He asked. Dr. Hazel Thornton. Her voice was as raspy and hesitant as always. I work in medical records. Doctor, Shaw's eyebrow rose slightly. You're a physician? I was. I have a condition now. She held up her trembling hands as explanation. I can't perform surgery anymore. Shaw studied her hands, then her face, then the photograph on his tablet. Something flickered in his expression. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition. Before he could speak again, a commotion erupted from the lobby. Raised voices, the sound of someone falling. Shaw's radio crackled with urgent communication. Commander, we have a situation. One of our detail has collapsed. Medical emergency. Shaw's attention shifted instantly. He gave Hazel one last look, his eyes lingering on her face with an intensity that suggested the conversation wasn't finished, then moved rapidly toward the source of the commotion. Hazel watched him go, her trembling hands clasped in front of her, her expression unchanged. But her heart was beating faster now. They had found her hospital. They were looking for her, specifically. And whoever had collapsed in the lobby might be the only thing standing between her carefully constructed invisibility and the revelation of everything she had spent 2 years hiding. The lobby had descended into controlled chaos by the time Shaw arrived. A young man in tactical gear was on the floor, his face pale and contorted with pain, his hands clutching his chest. Other agents had formed a protective circle around him, while medical staff hovered uncertainly at the periphery, clearly torn between their professional obligations and their fear of the armed men occupying their workspace. What happened? Shaw demanded, dropping to one knee beside the fallen agent. He just went down, sir. Another operator, barely older than the one on the floor, was clearly struggling to maintain his composure. We were securing the east corridor, and he grabbed his chest and dropped. Corporal Connor Reeves was 26 years old, a rising star in the protective detail who had been specifically selected for this mission because of his exceptional training and absolute reliability. Now he lay on the sterile tile of Walter Reed's lobby, his breathing labored and his skin taking on an ominous gray tint. Get a doctor, Shaw ordered. Now! Dr. Hartwell was already pushing through the crowd, his earlier irritation forgotten in the face of an actual medical emergency. This, at least, was territory where he belonged, where his expertise was unquestionable. Move back, he commanded, dropping beside the fallen agent. Give him room. He began his assessment with the practiced efficiency of thousands of similar examinations, his hands moving over Reeves's chest and neck, his eyes tracking vital signs. Respiratory distress, pulse rapid and weak. This isn't a standard cardiac event. Then what is it? Shaw demanded. Hartwell's brow furrowed with concentration. I'm not certain. The presentation is unusual. We need to get him to imaging, run a full workup. We don't have time for a full workup, Shaw interrupted. He's got information critical to national security, information that dies with him if you can't save him right now. Reeves coughed, a wet and desperate sound, and his lips began to take on a bluish tinge. Whatever was happening fast, and Hartwell's expression was shifting from professional confidence to something approaching genuine concern. I need assistance, he called out. Where's my trauma team? Several doctors and nurses pushed forward, but their movements were hesitant, confused by the unusual circumstances and the armed men who surrounded their patient. Among them was Dr. Archer Brennan, his earlier arrogance replaced by the focused intensity of someone finally in their element. Let me see, Archer said, shouldering past a nurse to examine Reeves. Chest sounds are diminished on the left side. Trachea appears deviated. His eyes widened. This could be a tension pneumothorax. Then decompress it, Hartwell ordered. I need a needle. 14 gauge, at least 3 inches. Archer's voice was confident, but his hands, as he reached for the emergency kit a nurse was holding, had begun to tremble slightly. Pressure. The pressure of saving a life while surrounded by armed men who would hold him accountable for failure. It was the kind of pressure that medical school didn't prepare you for, and Archer's extensive training was suddenly competing with very human fear. He positioned the needle, his hands shaking more noticeably now. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, Hartwell instructed. Steady hands, Brennan. Archer took a breath, aimed, and drove the needle in. Reeves screamed, not the relief of pressure release, but the agony of something gone wrong. Blood began to well around the needle insertion bonder, more than there should have been for a simple decompression. Wrong position, someone said from the crowd. That's not the right anatomical landmark. Archer withdrew the needle, his face pale. I hit exactly where the textbook says. The textbook assumes normal anatomy, the voice continued. He has pectus excavatum, mild, but enough to shift his landmarks medially. Every head in the lobby turned toward the source of the voice. Standing at the edge of the crowd, her trembling hands visible at her sides, was Hazel Thornton. Her mace was as expressionless as always, but something in her posture had changed. She stood straighter, more present, as if she had stepped forward from whatever shadow she usually occupied and was finally allowing herself to be seen. Hartwell's expression darkened. Thornton, what are you doing here? Get back to your filing. He's going to die, Hazel said quietly. Her voice was still raspy, but the hesitation was gone. Each word emerged with the clinical precision of someone who had made similar pronouncements before. Tension pneumothorax with possible hemothorax. The needle decompression failed because it missed the pleural space. He needs a different approach. And you would know this how? Archer's voice was sharp with defensiveness. You can't even hold a coffee cup. I know because I've seen it before. Hazel's eyes moved to Reeves, tracking the rising distress in his face, the increasing bluish tint to his lips. Second intercostal space, but adjusted laterally for his chest deformation. 14-gauge needle inserted at a slightly steeper angle to account for the modified anatomy, and it needs to happen in the next 60 seconds, or this conversation becomes irrelevant. Shaw studied her face with renewed intensity. Something was nagging at him. Something about the way she held herself now, the clarity in her voice, the absolute certainty in her diagnosis. Can you do it? He asked. Don't be ridiculous, Hartwell sputtered. Her hands shake. She can't. Can you do it? Shaw repeated, addressing Hazel directly. Hazel looked at Reeves, at the young man dying on the floor of a hospital, surrounded by doctors who couldn't save him. She looked at her own hands, trembling at her sides with their constant rhythmic shake. Then she looked at Shaw. Give me the needle. We're about to reach the moment everything changes. But first, if this story has you on the edge of your seat, do me a favor and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible stories of hidden warriors. And if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The reveal coming up will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you'll want to see more content like this. The silence that followed Hazel's words was absolute. Even Reeves's labored breathing seemed to pause, as if the universe itself was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Hartwell recovered first. Absolutely not. This woman hasn't performed a procedure in 2 years. Her hands are physically incapable of the precision required. If you want this man to die under her trembling fingers, be my guest, but I won't be responsible for... Dr. Hartwell, Shaw's voice cut through the objection like a blade. With respect, your methods have already failed. Your colleague has already failed. In approximately 45 seconds, this man will be beyond anyone's help. He turned to Hazel. I'm asking you directly. Can you save him? Hazel didn't answer immediately. Instead, she moved closer to Reeves, dropping to her knees beside him with a fluidity that seemed at odds with everything her colleagues thought they knew about her. She placed her trembling hand on his chest, feeling the abnormal give of the pneumothorax, the subtle shifting of anatomy that years of training had taught her to recognize. His O2 sat is dropping, one of the nurses reported, her voice tight with stress. 84% and falling. I can save him, Hazel said. Archer stepped forward, his earlier failure clearly burning in his chest. I'll do it. I know where I went wrong. Just let me... No. Hazel's voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that made Archer stop mid-step. You'll puncture the subclavian artery with the angle you're using. He has variant vasculature. I can see it in the way the superficial veins are presenting. You can't possibly diagnose variant vasculature from visual inspection, Hartwell protested. No. Hazel looked up, and for the first time her eyes met Hartwell's directly. But I can feel it, and I've operated on enough trauma patients to recognize the signs. She reached for the emergency kit, her trembling hands hovering over the array of medical implements. A 14-gauge needle, 3 inches long, exactly what was needed. 78%, the nurse announced. We're losing him. Hazel's fingers closed around the needle, and then something happened that made every person in that lobby question everything they thought that they knew about the woman they had dismissed as broken. Her hands stopped shaking, not gradually, not with effort or concentration. One moment, they were trembling with the same constant rhythm that had defined her existence at Walter Reed for 2 years. The next moment, they were perfectly, absolutely still as stone, as steady as death. "What the?" Archer breathed. Hazel didn't acknowledge the reaction. She was already moving, positioning the needle with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this procedure hundreds of times in conditions far worse than a well-lit hospital lobby. Her fingers found the correct intercostal space, adjusted for the patient's anatomical variation, and drove the needle home with a single fluid motion. The hiss of releasing pressure was immediate. Air and trace amounts of fluid escaped through the needle, and Reeves's desperate breathing began to ease almost instantly. "Oh, 2 climbing," the nurse reported, her voice thick with disbelief. 83, 86, 90. Hazel secured the needle, her steady hands working with a speed and accuracy that seemed to belong to someone entirely different from the trembling, submissive woman they had all known. She checked Reeves's vital signs, adjusted his position slightly, and began issuing orders to the surrounding medical staff with the natural authority of someone who was accustomed to commanding trauma teams. "I need a chest tube tray. He's still got fluid accumulating that needs to be drained properly. Start a large bore IV, type, and cross for 4 units. And someone get me imaging to confirm placement and rule out additional injury." The staff responded automatically, their training overriding their confusion. Nurses moved to gather supplies. Doctors stepped forward to assist. Even Hartwell, his face a mixture of shock and something that looked almost like fear, found himself following Hazel's directions. But it was Shaw who moved first. He stepped closer to Hazel, his eyes fixed on her hands, those impossibly steady hands that had been trembling constantly for as long as anyone could remember. "The tremors," he said quietly, "they were fake." Hazel didn't look up from her work. "Yes. All this time, 2 years. You've been pretending." "Yes." Shaw's hand moved to his tactical tablet, pulling up the photograph he had been using to search for his target. He looked at it, looked at Hazel, looked at the photograph again. Age adjustments, hair color changes, weight fluctuation, all the variables that could change a face over years of hiding. But the eyes were the same. "My God," Shaw breathed. He took a step backward, his posture shifting from investigative intensity to something approaching reverence. "It's you!" General Blackwood had been watching from the perimeter of the crowd. Now he pushed forward, his aged but commanding presence parting the assembled staff like Moses through the Red Sea. "Commander Shaw." His voice was controlled, but there was an undercurrent of something that might have been hope. "Report." Shaw didn't take his eyes off Hazel. "I found her, sir. I found Zero." The name rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. Zero. Most people didn't recognize it. It meant nothing to them, just another military code name in a world full of classified jargon. But to those who knew, to the tactical team members who had heard the legends, to General Blackwood who had lived through the events that created those legends, the name carried the weight of something almost mythical. Hazel finally looked up from her patient. Her hands remained steady as she transferred Reeves's care to the trauma team that had finally assembled. She rose to her feet slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. The mask was gone. The pretense of weakness, of submission, of being nothing more than a broken surgeon with trembling hands, all of it fell away like a discarded costume. What remained was something else entirely. Something that made Hartwell take an unconscious step backward. Something that made Archer's face go pale. Something that made the entire assembled crowd feel, for the first time, that they were in the presence of someone genuinely dangerous. "General Blackwood," Hazel said. Her voice had changed. The raspy hesitation was gone, replaced by a clarity and authority that seemed to fill the entire lobby. "It's been a long time." Blackwood studied her face, cataloging the changes that 7 years had wrought. The lines around her eyes, the gray threading through her hair, the weight of experiences that had aged her in ways that went beyond simple chronology. "Lieutenant Commander Thornton," he said formally. "Call sign, Zero, former combat surgeon, Omega Unit." The words landed like bombs in the silence. Lieutenant Commander, not the administrative assistant they had all assumed, not the broken surgeon whose career had ended in tragedy. A military officer, a combat surgeon, part of something called Omega Unit. "I don't understand," Hartwell said, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. "Thornton? Our Thornton? The woman who empties bedpans and files charts?" Blackwood turned to face him, and for a moment, something almost like disgust flickered across the general's weathered features. "Your Thornton," he said, "is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, classified, of course, awarded for actions so sensitive that only 12 people in the world know the full details." He returned his attention to Hazel. "She is also the only person alive who can perform Operation Zero." "What is Operation Zero?" Shaw asked. "I was told to find Zero, but the actual operation details are above my clearance." "They're above almost everyone's clearance," Blackwood replied. "What I can tell you is that Zero is the only surgical protocol capable of addressing certain types of trauma. Trauma that can only be treated by someone with Commander Thornton's specific combination of skills and training." Hazel remained still, her steady hands at her sides, her face a mask of controlled emotion. Whatever she was feeling about being discovered, about having her carefully constructed invisibility stripped away, she gave no external indication. "Why now?" she asked quietly. "After 7 years, why come looking for me now?" Blackwood's expression tightened. "Because we need you, because there's been an incident, and because you're the only one who can save the patient. I left that life behind, General. I left it behind for very good reasons." "I know." Blackwood's voice softened, just slightly. "I know what happened to your unit. I know why you ran. I know why you've been hiding." He paused. "But some situations don't allow us the luxury of staying hidden. Some situations require us to become who we used to be, no matter how much that costs." The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the hospital about the extraordinary scene unfolding in the lobby. Nurses, doctors, administrative staff, even patients who were mobile enough to leave their rooms, all gathering to witness something that none of them fully understood, but all of them recognized as significant. Among them, Ivy Caldwell stood with tears streaming silently down her face, watching the woman she had defended reveal herself as something far more than anyone had imagined. Hartwell had recovered enough to attempt speech. This is absurd. You're telling me that the woman I've been, that I've..." He stopped, unable to complete the sentence, unable to articulate the full scope of his mistreatment of someone who was, apparently, a decorated military hero. "Yes," Blackwood said flatly. "The woman you've been treating like a servant is someone I would trust with my life, and have." He reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew a single photograph, worn at the edges from handling. He held it up for Hazel to see. It showed 3 people in combat gear, their faces young and bright despite the dangerous environment that surrounded them. 2 men and a woman, all of them wearing the same insignia on their shoulders, all of them smiling with the fierce joy of people who had just accomplished something impossible. "Omega Unit," Blackwood said. "The complete team. Marcus, Elena, and you." Hazel's composure cracked, just for a moment, her eyes fixed on the photograph with an intensity that suggested she was seeing far more than the image itself. She was seeing memories, missions, moments that had shaped everything she had become. "Marcus and Elena are dead," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They died because of what we knew, because of what we could do." "I know," Blackwood lowered the photograph, "and I'm sorry. What happened to them should never have happened. The failure was ours, the organization's, not yours." "Then why are you here?" Hazel's voice hardened. "Why drag me back into a world that killed my friends? Why expose me to the same threats that destroyed everyone I cared about?" Blackwood was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of secrets that had haunted him for years. "Because the threat isn't over. Because what killed your friends is still out there. And because the only way to stop it is to bring Zero back." Shaw cleared his throat, drawing attention back to the operational reality of their situation. "General, with respect, we're on a timeline. If Commander Thornton is willing to accompany us, we need to move now." "Give us the room," Blackwood ordered. "Clear everyone who doesn't have classification. Commander Thornton and I need to speak privately." The crowd began to disperse, some reluctantly, others with the relief of people who had witnessed something they weren't sure they wanted to understand. Shaw coordinated the tactical team to secure the area, while Hartwell and the other senior staff were firmly but politely guided toward the periphery. Within minutes, the lobby had transformed from a crowded spectacle to an island of privacy in the center of the hospital. Only Blackwood, Hazel, Shaw, and a handful of senior agents remained. "Now," Blackwood said, his voice dropping to a level that wouldn't carry beyond their small circle, "let me tell you about Operation Zero." What he told her changed everything. The Vice President of the United States had been shot 4 hours earlier during a classified diplomatic mission in Yemen. The assassin had used a technique specifically designed to cause maximum internal damage, while leaving minimal external evidence. A technique that required intimate knowledge of human anatomy and the twisted creativity to weaponize that knowledge. It was a technique that had been developed by Omega Unit. The bullet fragmented on impact, Blackwood explained. The shrapnel pattern is consistent with our proprietary ammunition, the kind we developed specifically for high-value target elimination. Whoever did this wasn't just trying to kill the vice president, they were sending a message. Hazel's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. What message? That someone who knows Omega protocols is still active, still operational, and willing to turn those skills against our own government. "Marcus and Elena are dead," Hazel repeated, but there was less certainty in her voice now. "I saw the reports. I attended the memorial services." "You saw what we allowed you to see." Blackwood's expression was grim. "The truth is more complicated. Elena's death was confirmed. We recovered her body, conducted a full autopsy. She's gone." He paused. "But Marcus's situation was never fully resolved. His death was reported based on circumstantial evidence, a destroyed vehicle, DNA traces, but we never recovered a body." The implication hung in the air like smoke. "You think Marcus is alive?" Hazel said slowly. "You think he's the one who shot the vice president?" "I think it's possible, and if it's true, then you're the only person who might be able to stop him." Hazel turned away, her steady hands clenching into fists at her sides. 7 years of hiding, 7 years of building a new life, a smaller life, a life where she didn't have to be zero anymore, all of it crumbling in the space of a single conversation. "Operation Zero," she said quietly. "That's not just about saving the vice president, is it?" "No." Blackwood's voice was equally quiet. "Operation Zero is the protocol for engaging a rogue Omega operative. It requires someone with equal training, equal skills, and intimate knowledge of the target's capabilities. You want me to hunt Marcus? I want you to find him. What happens after that is your call." Hazel turned back to face the general, and something in her eyes had shifted. The professional distance was still there, the controlled emotion, the careful guard, but beneath it, something else was stirring, something that looked almost like determination. "And the vice president?" she asked. "Can he be saved?" "Only if we get him to proper medical facilities within the next 6 hours, and only if the surgeon operating on him understands the specific damage pattern that Omega ammunition creates." "Which means me. Which means you." Hazel was silent for a long moment, her gaze unfocused as she processed the implications of everything Blackwood had told her. The crowd around the periphery of the lobby watched, unable to hear the conversation, but acutely aware that something momentous was being decided. Ivy Caldwell caught Hazel's eye from across the room. The young nurse mouthed 2 words. "I believe." It was such a small gesture, such an insignificant thing in the face of national security crises and assassination attempts and the resurrection of a life Hazel had tried desperately to leave behind. But it mattered. It mattered because for 2 years, Ivy had been the only person in this hospital who had treated Hazel like a human being. The only one who had seen past the trembling hands and the submissive posture to recognize that something more was hidden beneath. Hazel took a deep breath, released it slowly. "I have conditions," she said. Blackwood's eyebrow rose slightly. "Name them." "First, I choose my support team. No arguments." "Agreed. Second, I want full access to whatever intelligence you have on Marcus. Everything. No redactions." Blackwood hesitated. "Some of that information is compartmentalized at the highest levels." "Then uncompartmentalize it. You're asking me to potentially hunt and kill someone who was once my brother in arms. I won't do it blind." A long pause. Then, "Agreed. Third," Hazel's voice softened. "When this is over, win or lose, I disappear again. New identity, new location, complete severance from any connection to Omega Unit or Operation Zero. That can be arranged. No. Hazel's eyes hardened. Not arranged, guaranteed, in writing, with contingencies that ensure the promise is kept, even if you're not around to enforce it. Blackwood studied her face, reading the determination there. She wasn't negotiating. She was setting terms. And she was fully prepared to walk away if those terms weren't met. Agreed, he said finally. You have my word, and you'll have the documentation before we leave this hospital. Hazel nodded slowly. Then she turned toward the crowd that still lingered at the edges of the lobby, her eyes scanning the faces until she found the one she was looking for. Nurse Caldwell. Ivy started, surprised to be addressed directly. Yes? You're coming with me. The statement produced an immediate reaction. Shaw stepped forward, his expression concerned. Commander, with respect, this is a highly classified operation. We can't just bring along civilian personnel. Nurse Caldwell stays with me or I don't go. Hazel's voice left no room for negotiation. She's competent, she's trustworthy, and she's the only person in this hospital who treated me with basic human decency for 2 years. I want her on my team. Shaw looked to Blackwood for guidance. The general studied Ivy for a long moment, assessing her with the same calculating attention he applied to all potential assets. Miss Caldwell, he said finally, are you willing to accompany Commander Thornton on a classified military operation? I should warn you that the risks are substantial and the security requirements absolute. You will not be able to discuss anything you see or hear, now or ever, with anyone outside the operation. Ivy's eyes were wide, but her voice was steady when she answered. I understand, sir. And you're still willing? Commander Thornton said she needs me. Ivy straightened her shoulders. That's enough for me. Blackwood nodded slowly. Then welcome to Operation Zero, Nurse Caldwell. God help us all. The next 30 minutes were a controlled explosion of activity. Hazel was provided with mission briefing materials, a change of clothes that included military-grade tactical gear, and a sidearm that she accepted with the casual familiarity of someone reuniting with an old friend. The hospital staff watched in stunned silence as the woman they had mocked and dismissed transformed before their eyes. The trembling hands were gone entirely now, replaced by movements of fluid precision. The hunched posture had straightened into something that spoke of command and capability. Even her face seemed different, the mask of submission replaced by an expression of focused intensity that made people instinctively step out of her way. Dr. Silas Hartwell stood at the edge of the activity, his face cycling through expressions of shock, denial, and something that looked increasingly like fear. The woman he had humiliated countless times, the surgeon he had relegated to filing charts and cleaning up messes, was being treated by 4-star generals and special operations personnel with a deference that bordered on reverence. When Hazel walked past him, her tactical gear fitted perfectly to her frame, her movements economical and purposeful, he found himself stepping backward without conscious decision. She stopped in front of him. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence stretched between them, filled with 2 years of accumulated slights and insults and casual cruelties. Dr. Hartwell, Hazel said finally. Her voice was calm, measured, without any apparent anger or resentment. You asked me earlier what I see when I look at myself. You called me a ghost of professional failure, a cautionary tale. Hartwell swallowed hard but couldn't find words to respond. You weren't entirely wrong, Hazel continued. I was a ghost, but not the kind you thought. She stepped closer, close enough that her next words were for him alone. I've held more lives in my hands than you can imagine. I've made decisions under fire that you couldn't comprehend in your worst nightmares. And I've watched people I loved die while I was powerless to save them. Her steady hand rose, almost touching Hartwell's chest before stopping. You thought you were powerful because you could make me feel small. You thought I was weak because I didn't fight back. She smiled, small and sad and utterly without warmth. I let you believe that because it served my purposes, because being invisible was the only way to stay alive. She lowered her hand and stepped back. The next time you encounter someone you think is beneath you, Dr. Hartwell, remember this moment. Remember how wrong you were about me, and consider the possibility that you might be equally wrong about them. She turned and walked away, leaving Hartwell standing alone in the middle of a corridor that suddenly felt much larger and emptier than it had before. Dr. Amber Lawson had positioned herself near the exit, trying to blend into the background as the tactical team prepared for departure. Her face was pale, her usual confidence replaced by something approaching genuine distress. When Hazel passed her, she flinched, as if expecting a similar confrontation. But Hazel didn't stop. She didn't even slow down. She simply walked past as if Amber didn't exist. Somehow, that was worse. Dr. Archer Brennan had retreated to the records room, hiding among the filing cabinets that Hazel had organized so meticulously for 2 years. He was still holding the needle that had failed to save Corporal Reeves, turning it over in his fingers as if trying to understand where he had gone wrong. The truth was simple. He had gone wrong by assuming that skill came from credentials and confidence. He had looked at a woman with trembling hands and seen incompetence. He had never considered that the tremors might be a mask, that the submission might be a strategy, that the person he was dismissing might possess capabilities that made his own skills look like a child playing with toys. Nurse Supervisor Fiona Walsh watched the departure from her office window. Her face was blank, but her knuckles were white where she gripped her clipboard. She had threatened Hazel, had warned her about consequences, had promised to end her career if she stepped out of line. The irony was bitter enough to taste. Dr. Derek Holloway had simply vanished. No one knew where he had gone, and no one cared enough to look. In the long-term care ward, Otis Brennan sat up in his bed, watching through the window as the helicopters prepared for departure. His aged mind had finally made the connection it had been struggling with all morning. Kandahar, 2017. The field hospital that had been overrun by enemy forces. He remembered the woman who had walked into that chaos. Remembered how she had operated on wounded soldiers while bullets flew overhead. Remembered her hands, steady as iron, never shaking despite the explosions and the screaming and the absolute certainty of death that hung over everything. They had called her an angel. They had called her Zero. And now he knew why she had looked so familiar. "Godspeed, Commander," he whispered to the empty room. "Give them hell." The tactical team boarded the helicopters in efficient formation, their movements practiced and precise. Ivy Caldwell, looking overwhelmed but determined in the flight suit she had been given, was guided to a seat near the center of the cabin. Hazel paused at the helicopter door, looking back at the hospital that had been her sanctuary and her prison for 2 years. The faces of the people who had mocked her, dismissed her, treated her as less than human, all of them were visible in the windows and doorways. She felt no satisfaction in their shock, no vindication in their discomfort. She felt only the familiar weight of a mantle she had tried to put down, settling back onto her shoulders as if it had never been removed. Zero. She had been Zero before, and it had cost her everything. Now, she was being asked to become Zero again, to embrace the identity that had brought her so much pain. But some things were more important than personal peace. Some situations demanded sacrifice, regardless of the cost. The vice president was dying, Marcus might be alive, and the only person who could address both situations was climbing into a helicopter and leaving behind the last vestiges of the life she had built. She stepped through the door and took her seat beside Ivy. Shaw followed, securing the door behind him. "Flight time to Andrews is 23 minutes, the pilot announced through the cabin speakers. "We're cleared for emergency approach. Hold on to something. This is going to be fast." The rotors spun up to full power, and the helicopter lifted off with a surge of controlled violence. Walter Reed National Military Medical Center fell away beneath them, shrinking until it was just another building in the sprawl of Bethesda. Hazel watched it disappear, her steady hands resting on her knees, her face a mask of professional composure. But inside, beneath the calm exterior, something was churning. Marcus might be alive, her brother in arms, her fellow operative, the man who had saved her life more times than she could count. If he was alive, why hadn't he contacted her? Why had he let her believe he was dead for 7 years? Why would he turn against the country they had both sworn to protect? And if she found him, if she tracked him down and confirmed that he was responsible for shooting the vice president, could she do what needed to be done? Could she stop the man she had once loved, like family? The helicopter banked hard, beginning its emergency approach to Andrews Air Force Base, and Hazel closed her eyes. She didn't have answers yet, but she was going to find them, one way or another. Shaw passed her a tactical tablet, its screen displaying classified intelligence that would have made most government officials blanch. "Everything we have on Marcus," he said. The general kept his word. Hazel took the tablet and began to read. The file was extensive: surveillance reports, communication intercepts, financial tracking, pattern analysis. 7 years of fragmentary evidence that suggested Marcus hadn't died in the explosion that was supposed to have killed him. 7 years of ghost sightings and unconfirmed reports, and the growing suspicion that one of the most dangerous operatives the United States had ever produced was still alive and operating outside anyone's control. The more she read, the colder she felt. The assassination techniques matched Marcus's signature style exactly. The ammunition used was from a batch that had been assigned exclusively to Omega Unit. The timing of the attack aligned with operational patterns that Marcus had favored during his active service. But there was more. A message had been left at the scene, a single piece of paper tucked into the vice president's pocket, written in handwriting that the analysts had confirmed was Marcus's. 4 words. "Find me 0, please." Hazel stared at those words for a long time, trying to understand what they meant. Marcus hadn't just shot the vice president. He had arranged for her to be drawn back into the field. He had used the attack as a signal, a beacon, a way to ensure that she would be the one sent after him. Why? Why would a rogue operative want to be found by the person most capable of stopping him? Unless he didn't want to be stopped. Unless he wanted something else entirely. The helicopter continued its screaming approach toward Andrews, carrying Hazel toward a confrontation she had spent 7 years trying to avoid. Behind her, Walter Reed was already fading from memory. Ahead of her, only uncertainty remained. And somewhere in the darkness between past and future, Marcus was waiting. Waiting for 0. Waiting for her. The helicopter touched down at Andrews Air Force Base with the controlled violence of a combat landing, its wheels barely kissing the tarmac gap before the doors were sliding open, and Shaw was gesturing for everyone to move. Hazel was already unbuckling, her movements automatic and efficient, the muscle memory of countless emergency deployments asserting itself despite 7 years of deliberate suppression. Beside her, Ivy struggled with her harness, her fingers fumbling with unfamiliar buckles. "Here!" Hazel reached over and released the mechanism with a single practiced motion. "Stay close to me. Don't speak unless spoken to. And whatever you see in the next few hours, remember that you chose to be here." Ivy nodded, her face pale but determined. "I understand." They emerged onto a runway that had been cleared of all normal traffic. A military transport aircraft waited 50 meters away, its engines already warming, its cargo ramp lowered like an open mouth waiting to swallow them. But it wasn't the aircraft that drew Hazel's attention. It was the medical team assembled beside it. 12 people in surgical scrubs, their equipment already loaded, their faces showing the particular tension of professionals who had been told just enough to know that something extraordinary was happening, but not enough to understand what. And standing at their head, his silver hair gleaming in the afternoon sun, was a face Hazel recognized from medical conferences and journal covers and the nightmares she sometimes had about the day everything fell apart. Dr. William Chen, chief of trauma surgery at Johns Hopkins, one of the most respected surgeons in the world, and the man who had trained her 15 years ago, before she had become something that no medical school could have prepared her for. "Hazel," Chen stepped forward, his expression a mixture of relief and something that looked almost like awe. "When they told me who they were bringing, I didn't believe it. I thought you were dead." "Not dead." Hazel's voice was flat, professional. "Just hiding. For 7 years. Chen shook his head slowly. 7 years, and not a word. Do you have any idea how many people searched for you? How many colleagues wondered what happened to the most promising surgeon they had ever trained? I had my reasons. I'm sure you did." Chen's eyes moved to the tactical gear she was wearing, to the sidearm at her hip, to the hardness in her face that hadn't been there when she was his student. "I'm sure you have reasons for a lot of things I don't understand," Shaw interrupted, his voice carrying the urgency of someone acutely aware of time constraints. "We can catch up later. Right now, we need to move. The patient is already in flight from the carrier group in the Mediterranean. We're meeting them at Ramstein." "Ramstein?" Chen nodded. "I've reviewed the preliminary medical reports. The damage is extensive but potentially survivable if we can get him into surgery within the next 4 hours. 3 hours and 47 minutes, Shaw corrected. "That's our window. After that, the internal bleeding becomes irreversible." Hazel was already moving toward the aircraft, her mind shifting into operational mode. "What's the surgical setup at Ramstein?" "State-of-the-art," Chen answered, falling into step beside her. "They've cleared their best operating theater for us. Full trauma capability, blood bank access, everything we might need. And the surgical team? You're looking at them." Chen gestured at the assembled medical personnel. Best trauma surgeons, anesthesiologists, and surgical nurses I could assemble on 4 hours' notice. They don't know who the patient is, just that it's a matter of national security. Hazel stopped at the base of the cargo ramp, turning to face Chen directly. The wound pattern. Have you seen the imaging? Chen's expression tightened. I have. It's unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of trauma surgery. The fragmentation pattern suggests a specialized ammunition type designed to cause maximum internal damage while minimizing external evidence. He paused. The analysts tell me it's consistent with something called Omega Protocol ammunition. It is. Hazel's voice was quiet. I helped design it. Chen's face went pale. You... what? Another time, Dr. Chen. Hazel started up the ramp. Right now, we have a patient to save. The flight to Ramstein Air Base took 6 hours and 23 minutes, most of which Hazel spent in intense consultation with Chen and his team, reviewing imaging, planning surgical approaches, and preparing for complications that might arise from wounds created by ammunition she had helped develop specifically to be unsurvivable. The irony was not lost on her. Ivy sat in a corner of the aircraft's medical staging area, watching the proceedings with wide eyes and saying nothing. She had been given a role, assisting with equipment preparation and supply organization, tasks simple enough that she could perform them without specialized training, but important enough that she felt useful. Occasionally, Hazel would glance over and offer a small nod of acknowledgement. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Ivy that she hadn't been forgotten, that her presence here mattered to someone. Shaw approached Hazel during a brief break in the surgical planning, his expression grim. We've received additional intelligence, he said quietly. The message Marcus left, the one asking you to find him, it wasn't the only communication. Hazel's steady hands paused over the surgical instrument she had been examining. What else? 3 hours after the shooting, a secure communication was intercepted, encrypted, routed through 17 different proxy servers, virtually untraceable. Shaw pulled out his tablet and showed her a transcript. But we managed to decode it. Hazel read the message, her face revealing nothing. They're coming for you, Zero. The same people who killed Elena, the same people who tried to kill me. I couldn't warn you directly without putting you at risk, so I did the only thing that would guarantee you would be protected. I made you important again. I'm sorry. There was no other way. Find me when it's over. I'll explain everything. Omega 1. She read it twice, then a third time, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. He didn't shoot the vice president to make a political statement, she said slowly. He did it to draw me out, to put me under military protection. That's our analysis as well. Shaw's voice was carefully neutral. The question is whether we can trust his motives. He claims he was trying to protect you, but he also nearly killed the second most powerful person in the country to do it. Marcus doesn't do anything without a reason. Hazel handed the tablet back. If he says someone is coming for me, then someone is coming for me. And if he says there was no other way... She trailed off, her eyes distant. Then he exhausted every other option before resorting to this. You trust him, even after everything. I trust that the man I knew would never betray his country without cause. Hazel's jaw tightened. Whether that man still exists, I don't know, but I intend to find out. The aircraft began its descent toward Ramstein, and Hazel returned to her surgical preparations with renewed focus. Whatever Marcus's reasons, whatever conspiracy he claimed was targeting her, none of it would matter if the vice president died on her operating table. First, she had to save a life. Then, she could worry about her own. Ramstein Air Base was controlled chaos when they landed. Military personnel scrambled to clear paths and secure perimeters, while medical staff prepared the operating theater for the most sensitive surgical procedure most of them would ever witness. The vice president arrived 17 minutes after Hazel's team, transported by a medical evacuation aircraft that had pushed its engines to the limit crossing the Atlantic. He was unconscious, his vital signs weak but stable, his body a roadmap of damage that made even Chen draw a sharp breath when he saw the imaging. The bullet entered here, Hazel said, pointing to a spot on the display that showed the vice president's torso. Standard entry wound, relatively clean. But on impact, the round fragmented into 17 separate pieces, each one designed to travel along a different tissue plane and cause maximum disruption to surrounding structures. That's not possible, one of the other surgeons protested. Bullets don't fragment in predictable patterns. The physics alone, these bullets do. Hazel's voice was flat. They were engineered to do exactly this. The fragmentation pattern isn't random, it's designed. Each piece targets a specific anatomical structure, heart, lungs, major vessels, ensuring that even if the initial wound doesn't kill, the cumulative damage will. Chen studied the imaging with growing horror. How do you even approach something like this? The fragments are distributed throughout the entire thoracic cavity. Carefully, Hazel began scrubbing at the surgical sink, her movements precise and economical. We don't try to remove all the fragments at once. We prioritize based on threat level. The piece near the aorta comes first, then the ones compromising respiratory function, then the smaller fragments that are causing slower bleeds. And you know the order because I designed the ammunition. Hazel looked up, meeting Chen's eyes directly. I know exactly what it's supposed to do, which means I know exactly how to undo it. The surgical team exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and something approaching fear. The woman they were about to follow into the operating room had just admitted to designing the weapon that had nearly killed the vice president, but she was also, apparently, the only person who could save him. Positions, everyone. Hazel finished scrubbing and moved toward the operating theater. We have 3 hours and 12 minutes. Let's not waste them. The surgery lasted 4 hours and 47 minutes. 4 hours and 47 minutes of tension so thick it could have been cut with a scalpel. 4 hours and 47 minutes of Hazel's steady hands moving through the vice president's chest cavity with the precision of a master watchmaker disassembling a bomb, which, in a sense, was exactly what she was doing. Each fragment had been placed, she now understood, with deliberate care. Marcus hadn't been trying to kill the vice president. He had been trying to wound him in a way that only Hazel could repair. The damage was severe but survivable, assuming the surgeon understood exactly what they were dealing with. It was a message written in blood and metal. I need you, Zero. Come find me. Chen assisted throughout, his decades of experience valuable, but his ego wisely set aside as he followed Hazel's lead. The other surgeons rotated in and out, their stamina no match for the sustained intensity of the procedure, but Hazel never flagged. She worked with the focused determination of someone who had operated in far worse conditions. Her hands never trembling, her concentration never wavering. Ivy watched from the observation gallery above, her face pressed against the glass, her eyes tracking every movement with a mixture of horror and fascination. The woman she had defended for 2 years, the quiet surgeon with the shaking hands who filed charts and accepted insults without complaint, was performing a medical miracle. Her fingers moved with a grace that seemed almost superhuman, finding fragments that shouldn't have been findable, repairing damage that shouldn't have been repairable. This was what Hazel had been hiding. This was what she had given up. And watching her now, seeing the full scope of her capabilities unleashed for the first time, Ivy finally understood why someone with this much skill would choose to pretend she had none. Power like this came with a price measured in the lives of everyone who had ever known what she could do. The final fragment came out at the 4-hour and 39-minute mark, a tiny piece of metal that had lodged itself millimeters from the vice president's heart. Hazel extracted it with a single fluid motion, dropped it into a collection tray, and stepped back from the table. Close him up, she said, her voice hoarse from hours of quiet commands. Standard thoracic protocol. He'll need at least 72 hours in intensive care, but he's going to live. Chen looked at her with an expression that combined exhaustion, relief, and something approaching reverence. That was the most extraordinary surgical performance I've ever witnessed. The precision, the decision-making under pressure, the sheer technical skill. He shook his head. Where did you learn to do that? In places I hope you never have to see. Hazel stripped off her surgical gloves and moved toward the scrub room. Take good care of him, Dr. Chen. He's important. Hazel, wait. Chen followed her. What happens now? Where do you go from here? She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder. I go find the man who did this. I find out why, and then... She trailed off, her eyes distant. And then I decide what to do about it. Be careful. Chen's voice was soft with genuine concern. Whatever you've become, whatever you've had to do, you're still the most gifted surgeon I ever trained. The world needs people like you. The world has plenty of surgeons. Hazel pushed through the door. What it needs right now is Zero. Shaw was waiting for her outside the surgical suite, his expression tense with new information. "We've located Marcus," he said without preamble. "Or rather, he's located us. A communication came through 15 minutes ago while you were finishing the surgery." Hazel took the tablet he offered, reading the message on the screen. "Surgery complete. Well done, Zero. I knew you could do it. Now it's time for the truth. Coordinates attached. Come alone. Trust no one. Omega 1. The coordinates pointed to a location in rural Virginia, an abandoned military facility that had been decommissioned years ago. "It's obviously a trap," Shaw said. "We should send a tactical team, secure the location before you go anywhere near it." "No," Hazel's voice was firm. "He said come alone. He'll know if I bring backup, and he'll disappear again. 7 years of nothing, and now he's finally reaching out. I'm not going to waste this chance." "Commander Thornton, I can't authorize you to walk into a potential ambush without support." "Then don't authorize it." Hazel met his eyes steadily. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm telling you what's going to happen." Shaw studied her face for a long moment, reading the determination there. "General Blackwood won't be happy." "General Blackwood doesn't get to make this decision. Marcus was my teammate, my friend. If he has information about who's targeting me, I need to hear it. And I need to hear it from him, directly, without the filter of military intelligence and operational security." She handed the tablet back and started walking toward the exit. "Wait," Shaw's voice stopped her. "At least take a communication device. Something so we can track your location if things go wrong." Hazel considered this, then nodded slowly. "Fine. But no one moves unless I give the signal. Understood?" "Understood." She continued toward the exit, her stride confident and purposeful. Behind her, Shaw was already making calls, arranging backup that would stay out of sight but remain ready to intervene if necessary. He didn't trust Marcus. He wasn't sure he fully trusted Hazel, but he knew better than to try to stop a force of nature when it was determined to move. The abandoned facility was exactly as desolate as Hazel had expected. Crumbling concrete buildings overgrown with vegetation, rusted fencing that had long ago ceased to provide any security, the ghosts of military purpose slowly being reclaimed by nature. She had come alone, as requested, though Shaw's tracking device was hidden in her boot, and she knew that a tactical team was positioned 3 miles away, ready to move at her signal. Not that she expected to need them. If Marcus wanted her dead, he had had countless opportunities over the years to make that happen. The fact that he had orchestrated this elaborate scenario, wounding the vice president in a way only she could repair, suggested he wanted something else entirely. She found him in what had once been the facility's command center, a circular room with walls covered in obsolete equipment and windows that had long ago lost their glass. He was sitting in a chair at the center of the room, his back to the door, his silhouette achingly familiar despite the years of separation. "You came alone." His voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by time and whatever experiences had filled the 7 years of his supposed death. "I wasn't sure you would." "You asked me to." Hazel stepped into the room, her hand resting near her sidearm, but not drawing it. "You shot the vice president to get my attention. The least I could do was show up." Marcus turned, and Hazel saw his face for the first time in 7 years. He had aged. The laugh lines around his eyes had deepened into something harder, and there was gray at his temples that hadn't been there before. A scar ran along his left jaw, a souvenir from whatever violence had filled his years of hiding. But his eyes were the same, dark and intelligent, and filled with the particular warmth of someone who had shared too many life-or-death moments with her to ever be a stranger. "Zero." He said the name like a prayer. "God, it's good to see you." "Marcus," Hazel's voice was carefully controlled. "You have a lot of explaining to do." "I know." He stood slowly, keeping his hands visible, making no move that could be interpreted as threatening. "And I will explain everything. But first, I need you to understand something." He reached into his jacket, and Hazel's hand moved to her weapon. "Easy." Marcus pulled out a photograph, holding it up for her to see. "I'm not reaching for a gun. I'm reaching for proof." Hazel looked at the photograph. It showed a man in a suit, his face partially obscured by shadow, but recognizable to anyone who followed political news. Senator James Whitfield, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. "What am I looking at?" Hazel asked. "The man who ordered Elena's death." Marcus's voice was flat, controlled, but underneath it was a rage that had been simmering for 7 years. "The man who tried to have me killed." The man who has been running a shadow operation inside the intelligence community for the past decade, selling classified information to foreign powers and eliminating anyone who gets too close to the truth. Hazel studied the photograph, her mind racing. You're telling me a sitting United States senator is responsible for killing our teammate? I'm telling you, he's responsible for a lot more than that. Marcus lowered the photograph. Elena stumbled onto his operation during a routine intelligence gathering mission. She found evidence that Whitfield had been communicating with hostile foreign agents, providing them with information about American military operations in exchange for money and political favors. And when she reported it, she didn't get the chance. Marcus's jaw tightened. Whitfield has people everywhere, in the military, in the intelligence agencies, in law enforcement. Elena was killed before she could bring her evidence to anyone who could act on it, made to look like an accident during a training exercise. Hazel remembered Elena's death. The official report had said equipment failure, a tragic accident, nothing suspicious, but she had never quite believed it. And you? She asked. How did you survive? I almost didn't. Marcus touched the scar on his jaw. The explosion that was supposed to kill me came very close to succeeding, but I managed to get out, barely, and spent the next 3 months recovering in a safe house in Eastern Europe. Why didn't you contact me? Why let me think you were dead for 7 years? Because Whitfield was watching you. Marcus's voice softened. After Elena died and I disappeared, you were the only one left who knew about Omega Unit's capabilities. Whitfield couldn't risk that you might somehow continue Elena's investigation, so he had you under surveillance for years. Hazel thought about her time at Walter Reed, the endless humiliations, the careful invisibility she had cultivated. That's why I was hiding, she said slowly. Not just from the grief. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it. Your instincts were right. Whitfield had people in that hospital, watching you, reporting on your activities. As long as you appeared broken and harmless, you were safe. But if you had shown any sign of recovering, of returning to your former capabilities, they would have killed me too. Yes, Marcus's voice was heavy with guilt. I wanted to warn you, wanted to reach out so many times, but any contact would have put you at risk. So I watched from a distance, gathering evidence, building a case that would expose Whitfield and protect you at the same time. And shooting the vice president? How does that fit into protecting me? Marcus smiled grimly. Whitfield has been planning something big. I don't know the details, but my sources tell me it involves eliminating everyone who might be able to expose him. That includes you, and it includes anyone else who worked on sensitive operations during his time as committee chairman. So, you shot the vice president to, what? Draw attention to the conspiracy? I shot the vice president in a way that guaranteed you would be the one called to save him. Marcus stepped closer. I knew exactly what kind of surgical challenge it would present. I knew that only someone with your training could repair the damage. And I knew that once you were called back into service, you would be under military protection, too high profile for Whitfield to touch. Hazel stared at him, processing the implications. You used me. You used the vice president. You nearly killed an innocent man to execute some elaborate protective strategy. There was no other way. Marcus's voice was steady, unapologetic. Whitfield's people were closing in. I had maybe 48 hours before they moved against you. This was the only play I had that could guarantee your safety, while also creating enough chaos to disrupt whatever Whitfield is planning. And now what? What's supposed to happen next? Marcus reached into his jacket again and pulled out a USB drive. This contains everything. 7 years of evidence, communications, financial records, witness statements, operational plans, enough to bring down Whitfield and everyone connected to him. He held it out to her. I can't deliver this myself. Whitfield's people would intercept me before I got anywhere near anyone who could act on it. But you, he smiled, you just saved the vice president's life. You're a hero. You have access to the highest levels of government. Hazel looked at the USB drive, then at Marcus's face. You want me to expose a sitting senator, to bring down a conspiracy that reaches into the heart of the intelligence community, to paint a target on my back even bigger than the one that's already there. I want you to finish what Elena started. Marcus's voice was soft but intense. I want you to make her death mean something. I want you to burn Whitfield's operation to the ground and make sure no one ever threatens us again. For a long moment, Hazel didn't move. The weight of the decision pressed down on her, the knowledge that whatever she chose would shape the rest of her life. Then she reached out and took the USB drive. "Elena was my friend," she said quietly. "If Whitfield killed her, then he's going to answer for it. But Marcus—" She looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "If I find out you're lying to me, if any of this turns out to be manipulation or misdirection, I will hunt you down myself. And next time, I won't be trying to save you." Marcus nodded slowly, accepting the terms. "Fair enough, but I'm not lying, Zero. I've never lied to you, and I'm not starting now." Hazel pocketed the USB drive and turned toward the exit. Then she paused, looking back over her shoulder. "What will you do now? Where will you go?" "Somewhere far away." Marcus smiled sadly. "Once Whitfield is exposed, his network will collapse. The people hunting both of us will have bigger problems than 2 former operatives. Maybe then—" He trailed off. "Maybe then we can finally stop running." "Maybe." Hazel's voice was non-committal. "Take care of yourself, Marcus." "You too, Zero. And thank you. For coming, for listening, for being the person I always knew you were." She left without another word, walking back through the abandoned facility toward the extraction point where Shaw and his team were waiting. Behind her, Marcus watched her go, his expression a mixture of hope and sorrow. 7 years of planning, 7 years of sacrifice. All of it leading to this moment, to Hazel walking away with the evidence that could bring down the most dangerous conspiracy in American political history. He had done everything he could. Now, it was up to her. The flight back to Washington was quiet. Hazel sat alone in the rear of the aircraft, the USB drive hidden in an interior pocket, her mind churning through everything Marcus had told her. Shaw had tried to debrief her about the meeting, but she had deflected his questions with vague answers and half-truths. Whatever was on that drive, whatever evidence Marcus had gathered, she needed to see it for herself before deciding how to proceed. Ivy sat nearby, watching her with the quiet concern of someone who recognized when a friend was carrying a heavy burden. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, leaning closer so the conversation remained private. Hazel considered the question. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought I knew what happened to my team. I thought I understood why I had to hide, but now—" She shook her head. "Now everything I believed is being questioned." "Do you trust him, Marcus?" "I trust that he believes what he told me." Hazel's eyes were distant. "Whether that belief is accurate is another matter entirely." The aircraft landed at Andrews Air Force Base just after midnight. A military convoy was waiting to transport them back to Walter Reed, where General Blackwood had established a temporary command center to coordinate the ongoing security response. The hospital looked different at night, quieter, emptier. The chaos of the afternoon had given way to the muted rhythms of overnight operations, skeleton crews maintaining essential functions while the rest of the staff recovered from the day's extraordinary events. Blackwood met them in a conference room that had been hastily converted into a briefing center. His face was tired but alert, the expression of a man who had been managing crises for too many hours but refused to stand down. "Commander Thornton," he gestured to a chair, "please, we have much to discuss." Hazel sat, Shaw taking a position near the door. Ivy was guided to a waiting area outside, her role in the operational discussions apparently concluded. "The Vice President is stable," Blackwood began. "Dr. Chen reports that your surgical intervention was nothing short of miraculous. The medical team is cautiously optimistic about a full recovery." "Good." Hazel's voice was flat. "What about the investigation into the shooting?" Blackwood's expression tightened. "We've made some progress. The bullet fragments you extracted have been analyzed. As you suspected, they match ammunition that was developed specifically for Omega Unit operations. Which means the shooter had access to classified military technology." "Correct." Blackwood leaned forward. "Commander, I need to ask you directly. During your meeting with Marcus, did he provide any information about his motivations, about why he would attack the Vice President?" Hazel considered her response carefully. The USB drive felt heavy in her pocket, a secret that could change everything. "He claimed he was trying to protect me," she said finally. "He said there's a conspiracy within the intelligence community, people who killed Elena and tried to kill him. He shot the Vice President to draw me out of hiding and put me under protection." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "Did he provide any evidence for these claims?" "He provided allegations." Hazel met the general's gaze steadily. I need time to verify them before I can say whether they're credible. Commander, if there's evidence of a conspiracy within the government, I need to know about it immediately. This is a matter of national security. With respect, General, that's exactly why I need to verify it first. Hazel's voice was firm. If Marcus is right, then this conspiracy has people everywhere, including possibly within the military itself. Sharing unverified intelligence could tip off the very people we're trying to expose. Blackwood studied her face for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of pressing further against the benefits of maintaining her cooperation. Very well, he said finally. I'll give you 72 hours to conduct your investigation, but I expect a full briefing at the end of that period, regardless of what you find. Understood. In the meantime, you remain under military protection. Shaw and his team will be assigned to your security detail until we determine whether the threat Marcus mentioned is credible. Hazel nodded, rising from her chair. Thank you, General. I'll be in touch. She left the conference room, her mind already racing through plans and possibilities. 72 hours wasn't much time, but it might be enough. Enough to verify Marcus's evidence. Enough to identify the scope of the conspiracy. Enough to determine whether Senator Whitfield was truly responsible for Elena's death. And if he was, then Hazel would make sure he faced justice, one way or another. The next 48 hours were a blur of investigation and verification. Hazel worked from a secure location provided by Shaw's team, a safe house in suburban Virginia, where she could examine Marcus's evidence without risk of interception. Ivy stayed with her, proving surprisingly useful at organizing the massive amounts of data contained on the USB drive. The evidence was damning. Financial records showing payments from foreign governments, routed through shell companies to accounts controlled by Senator Whitfield's associates. Communication intercepts revealing discussions of classified military operations that only someone with Intelligence Committee access could have known about. Witness statements from former operatives who had been threatened or bribed into silence. And most devastating of all, a video recording. Senator Whitfield, in what appeared to be a private office, speaking on the phone about Elena. She's becoming a problem. Her investigation is getting too close to things that need to stay buried. I want her handled, quietly. Make it look like an accident. Hazel watched the recording 3 times, her face stone, her hands finally, after years of pretending, genuinely trembling. Elena had been murdered, not by enemy combatants, not by the hazards of their dangerous profession, by an American politician who had valued his secrets more than her life. Is this real? Ivy asked softly, watching Hazel's reaction. Can this be verified? Marcus included authentication data. Hazel's voice was hoarse. Metadata, chain of custody documentation, corroborating evidence. If he fabricated this, he did it with a level of sophistication that would rival any intelligence agency in the world. So you believe him? I believe Elena was murdered. Hazel stood abruptly, moving to the window, her back to the room. I believe Whitfield is responsible, and I believe he needs to answer for what he's done. What are you going to do? Hazel was silent for a long moment, staring out at the suburban landscape that surrounded the safe house. Ordinary houses, ordinary lives, people going about their daily routines, unaware of the corruption that lurked in the halls of power. I'm going to give this evidence to people who can act on it, she said finally. The FBI, the Justice Department, the oversight committees that are supposed to prevent exactly this kind of abuse. Won't Whitfield have people in those agencies too? Marcus said the conspiracy reaches everywhere. Probably. Hazel turned back to face Ivy. But not everywhere. There are still good people in the government. People who took oaths to protect and serve, and who meant it. I have to trust that some of them can be reached. And if you're wrong, if Whitfield finds out what you're doing before you can expose him, Hazel smiled grimly, then I'll handle it the way I've handled threats before, whatever it takes. The exposure of Senator Whitfield's conspiracy took 6 months. 6 months of careful maneuvering, of building coalitions, of providing evidence to trustworthy contacts in law enforcement and the intelligence community. 6 months of watching Whitfield continue his public life, speaking on television about national security and patriotism while knowing the full scope of his crimes. But eventually, the case was ready. FBI agents arrested Senator Whitfield on a Tuesday morning in full view of news cameras that had been tipped off about the operation. He was led out of his office in handcuffs, his face a mixture of shock and rage. unable to comprehend how his carefully constructed empire had collapsed so completely. The trials took another year. Whitfield was convicted on 17 counts, including espionage, conspiracy to commit murder, and corruption. He received a life sentence without possibility of parole. 12 of his associates were convicted alongside him, their sentences ranging from 10 years to life depending on their level of involvement. The conspiracy was destroyed, Elena was avenged, and Hazel, finally, was free. She returned to Walter Reed one last time, 6 months after Whitfield's conviction, to collect the few personal items she had left behind during her hasty departure. The hospital looked the same as it had on that chaotic day when the helicopters had landed and her carefully constructed invisibility had been stripped away. The same sterile corridors, the same beeping monitors, the same controlled chaos of medical professionals going about their work. But the people were different. Dr. Silas Hartwell had retired, citing health reasons, though rumors suggested the humiliation of discovering how wrong he had been about Hazel had contributed to his decision. Doctor. Amber Lawson had transferred to a hospital in California, seeking a fresh start away from the colleagues who now looked at her with knowing contempt. Dr. Archer Brennan had quietly improved his attitude, his arrogance tempered by the memory of how spectacularly he had failed when it mattered most. Nurse supervisor Fiona Walsh had actually written Hazel a letter of apology. It had been stiff and formal, clearly difficult for her to compose, but genuine in its acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Dr. Derek Holloway had been fired for unrelated misconduct that had come to light during the security investigation following the vice president's shooting. No one mourned his departure. The only person Hazel truly wanted to see was waiting for her in the lobby. Ivy Caldwell had continued working at Walter Reed throughout the trials and investigations. Her role in Operation Zero, earning her a commendation and a promotion. She was now a senior nurse in the surgical wing, respected by colleagues who had once treated her as invisible. "You came back," Ivy said, pulling Hazel into an embrace that surprised them both. "I needed to say goodbye properly." Hazel returned the hug, then stepped back. "And I needed to thank you for believing in me when no one else did." "I didn't do anything special." Ivy's eyes were bright with emotion. "I just treated you like a person. That shouldn't be remarkable." "No," Hazel agreed. "It shouldn't. But it was, and I won't forget it." They walked together through the surgical wing, past the spots where Hazel had endured humiliation after humiliation, past the corridors where she had perfected her mask of submission. Otis Brennan was still in long-term care, his recovery slower than hoped, but still progressing. When he saw Hazel, his weathered face split into a grin. "Commander," he attempted a salute from his wheelchair. "I knew I recognized you. Kandahar, 2017, you saved my whole unit." "I remember." Hazel knelt beside him, taking his weathered hand in her steady one. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that I've seen you again." Otis squeezed her fingers. "The news said you took down some big conspiracy. That true?" "It's true." "Good." Otis nodded with satisfaction. "You were always a fighter, even when you were pretending to be broken." His eyes grew distant. "We all pretend sometimes, to survive. The important thing is knowing when to stop pretending." Hazel stayed with him for an hour, listening to his stories about recovery and rehabilitation, about the small victories that made each day worth facing. When she finally left, she carried his words with her. Knowing when to stop pretending. That was the real challenge, wasn't it? Not the surgery, not the combat, not the investigations, or the conspiracies, or the threats. The real challenge was learning when to let the mask fall, learning when to be yourself again. General Blackwood met her outside the hospital, standing beside a nondescript government vehicle with tinted windows. "Commander Thornton," he saluted. "I wanted to personally deliver the news. Your new identity documents are ready. As promised, complete severance from your previous life. New name, new location, no connections to Omega Unit or anything else from your past." Hazel took the envelope he offered, feeling its weight, her future wrapped in paper. "Thank you, General. You've earned it." Blackwood's expression was grave. "What you did, what you sacrificed, it won't ever be publicly acknowledged. The details are too sensitive. But I want you to know that the people who matter, the people who understand what really happened, we're grateful. Gratitude isn't necessary." Hazel smiled slightly. "I did what needed to be done, just like always." "Nevertheless," Blackwood extended his hand. It's been an honor, Commander. Take care of yourself. Hazel shook his hand, then turned toward the vehicle that would take her to her new life. She paused at the door, looking back at the hospital one last time. 2 years of hiding in plain sight. 2 years of pretending to be broken. 2 years of waiting for a moment that had finally come. The mask was off. The mission was complete. And somewhere out there, Marcus was waiting. His last message had arrived 3 days ago, encrypted and routed through the same untraceable channels he had used before. It's over, Zero. Whitfield is done. The threat is eliminated. I'm heading somewhere warm. Maybe we'll meet again someday. Until then, thank you for believing in me, for finishing what we started. Omega-1 out. Hazel smiled as she climbed into the vehicle. Maybe they would meet again. Or maybe this was goodbye. Either way, she was finally free. Free to choose her own path. Free to be whoever she wanted to be. Free to live. The vehicle pulled away from Walter Reed, carrying Hazel Thornton toward a future that was, for the first time in 7 years, entirely her own. Behind her, the hospital grew smaller in the distance. Ahead of her, possibility stretched infinite and bright. She had been Zero. She had been broken. She had been invisible. Now, she was simply herself. And that, she realized, was the greatest freedom of all. This story reminds us of a truth we often forget in our daily rush to judge and categorize the people around us. The quiet coworker who never speaks up. The elderly neighbor who keeps to herself. The person with trembling hands who seems incapable of anything remarkable. We look at them and we think we understand. We think we see, but we see nothing. Hazel Thornton endured 2 years of humiliation, mockery, and dismissal from people who believed their credentials made them superior. They laughed at her shaking hands. They whispered about her failures. They treated her as less than human because she appeared weak. And they were completely, devastatingly wrong. The lesson here is simple but profound. Never judge a person by their surface. Never assume that silence means weakness or that struggle means incompetence. The most extraordinary people often hide in plain sight, carrying burdens we cannot imagine, possessing strengths we cannot comprehend. Hazel chose invisibility to survive, but when the moment demanded it, she revealed who she truly was and changed everything. So, here is my challenge to you. Think about someone in your life who you have dismissed or underestimated. A coworker, a family member, a stranger you pass every day. Consider the possibility that you are seeing only the mask, not the person beneath. And maybe, just maybe, be the Ivy Caldwell in their story. Be the one who sees. Be the one who believes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of hidden heroes. And remember, the person you underestimate today might be the one who saves you tomorrow.